The movie Ju-on, or The Grudge, has been remade and adapted over 30 times. It's such a recognizable property that most people are familiar with the name. And while these films have become an international sensation, most people don't know the story behind the films. And after I did my research on it, I found that the story that inspired The Grudge is much more shocking and frightening than the films are. At least the American films. And before we go any further, I apologize in advance if I say any of these names incorrectly, and if I do mispronounce them, please feel free to correct me in the comments. When I was looking into the backstory of the movie The Grudge, or Ju-on, I found that in the 1900s there's the story of Kayoko, and it's very similar to The Grudge. So this was essentially an urban legend that was making its rounds in Japan. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky in my research, because while I was trying to look up the legend of Kayoko, it gets a little bit difficult to tell what's the movie and what's the urban legend at a certain point. But I did find that there is a very common story amongst it. And so, to the best of my knowledge, the original urban legend that was going around is the legend of Kayoko. She was a Japanese housewife and a mother to her young son. There's different tellings of the urban legend. In some of the tellings, Kayoko is having an affair with a professor who she's in love with, while in other tellings she's not having an affair. But either way, her husband became jealous and violent, and he flew into rage, and he ended up violently murdering Kayoko, and murdering their son as well. In some versions of the story, he even murders their cat. And then the trauma from that killing, her and her son come back as Onryo, which is a vengeful and spiteful spirit. And this is the spirit that we're very familiar with when we watch movies like Ju-on and The Grudge. And so you can see that this urban legend obviously very much inspired the film. And while I thought that was really interesting, I wanted to go even deeper. Because stories don't just tend to pop up out of nowhere, most stories have a long and fruitful history. And to be honest, most stories that we tell today are just retellings of stories from the past. And this story is no different, because the original story is actually a legend that's over 300 years old. And if you thought Ju-on and The Grudge was shocking, this is honestly one of the darker stories I've ever found. The myth of Oiwa, the paper lantern ghost. The oldest version of the story I can find is from the early 1700s. And in the story, there's a young woman and her name's Oiwa. And she lived in Japan, and she was married to a samurai named Ayamon. So Ayamon was a big brute, and he was also a thief and a liar. And to top it all off, unfortunately, he was abusive as well. And this has gone on for a long time, where Ayamon would go out, commit crimes, lie about it, he would hit Oiwa, and life was just hellish for her being married to him. And Oiwa felt very isolated because she lived in a different town from her family. So one day Oiwa worked up the courage to run away from her abuser, and she ran home to her parents. So days later, Oiwa's father is out walking, and Oyomon finds him. He strikes up a conversation with him, and then suddenly he pulls out a blade and he kills Oiwa's father right there on the path. He then runs over to Oiwa's parents' house, and he finds Oiwa, and he tells her that her father was killed by a bandit, and that he will avenge her only if she agrees to come back with him. Well, as you can imagine, Oiwa is completely devastated, and so is her family. And feeling that she has no other choice, she agrees and she goes with him. And slowly things progress back to the life she had before, unfortunately. But then things change because she gets pregnant. Oiwa is under so much stress between the pregnancy and the abuse from Oyomon and the horrible anxiety she has because of the life he leads, that she falls very ill. And so as she gets sick and she becomes bedridden, her husband decides that he's done with her because he no longer sees value in her. And at this point, he just wants to be rid of her. So next door lives a doctor, and the doctor and Oyomon are great friends. And the doctor has a granddaughter that's young and beautiful, and Ayamon becomes very infatuated with her. And after a short amount of time, she falls in love with him as well. The doctor sees the benefit of his granddaughter marrying Ayamon, so together Ayamon and the doctor conspire to get rid of Oiwa. The doctor concocts a face cream, which he then gives to Oiwa. He tells her that it'll help her with her illness and that she has to put it on every day. Oiwa doesn't know, but this face cream is actually poisoned. So each day, she does as the doctor tells her, and she applies this cream to her face, and it slowly makes her more and more sick, until soon she's completely bedridden. Oyomon and the doctor only intended for this to kill her, but an unintended side effect of the poison is her face starts to deteriorate, and it becomes extremely disfigured. She becomes completely unrecognizable. And every day she keeps applying this cream, and she doesn't realize what it's doing because there are no mirrors in her room, no reflective surfaces. Oiwa took them all away. So at this point, Oiwa is sick and extremely disfigured, but she's not dead, and that's all Oiwa wants. And he's just so angry that she's alive and he can't get rid of her so he can get remarried. And so up until this point in the story, you can tell Oiwa is just a completely evil person, but then he somehow makes it even worse. Oiwa then decides that he can get a divorce if he proves that Oiwa has been unfaithful to him. So he then hires somebody to break in and sexually assault her. But when the man arrives, he sees how disfigured Oiwa is, and he really feels pity for her. So he confesses everything about Oiwa's plans to kill her. The man then reveals a mirror and shows Oiwa how disfigured she's become from this poisoning. And when she sees herself, she's completely horrified by what she sees, and all she wants to do is hide from the image, so she starts grabbing her hair and pulling it in front of her face, attempting to hide her face, but her hair starts pulling out in clumps because of the poison. At this point, Oiwa is completely devastated and just utterly heartbroken. In despair, she looks around and she sees a samurai sword on the wall. She rips it down, and before the bandit can stop her, she unsheaths the blade and plunges it into her stomach, proceeding to kill herself. Oiwa drops to the floor, and she calls out Oiwa's name and curses him as she dies. When Oiwa returns home, he sees Oiwa's body, and he's just overjoyed. Oiwa's servant sees how overjoyed Oiwa is, and he decides to question him, because he finds it odd that he would be celebrating his wife's death. Afraid that the servant might figure it out, Oiwa unsheaths his samurai blade and slays the servant. He then takes the body of the servant and of Oiwa, and he nails them to large wooden doors, and he throws them into the river, and slowly the bodies sink down. And Oiwa throwing these doors with their bodies into the river is what seals the curse. So Oiwa goes on and moves on with his life and marries the doctor's granddaughter. His new wife moves in, and they live in the same house next door to the doctor. And nobody finds the bodies, so Oiwa is seemingly in the clear. He moves on with his life and his new wife, and they live together peacefully for a time. One night, Oiwa wakes up, and in the bed next to him is Oiwa. Her disfigured and twisted face is staring up at him, her large, unblinking eyes locked with his. Oiwa is completely terrified, and he jumps out of bed and he pulls out his sword. He expertly hacks her to pieces. And once the body is cut up, he realizes that it wasn't Oiwa, it was his new wife, covered in blood. He staggers out of the room completely horrified, and then he runs from the house. Wanting to get help, he runs to his father-in-law next door, the doctor. He bursts in through the front door, and he's confronted by the dead servant. The servant reaches for him, and Oiwa draws his sword. Oiwa swings his sword, chopping down the servant. But once again, the illusion fades, and he realizes that he just slayed the doctor. Oiwa races away as fast as he can, trying to get away from the vengeful spirits and what they might make him do next. Oiwa runs through the dark, frantic and afraid, wanting to get help, but knowing that he can't. And everywhere that Oiwa goes, the ghosts follow. In the middle of the night, as he ran down the path, he was terrified of where the ghosts might be. But every time he comes to a lantern in the road, he would see Oiwa's face in the fire. Soon Oiwa could no longer take it, and he lost his mind. And Oiwa had her vengeance. And that is the story of Oiwa. So as you can see, this 300-year-old tale that inspired these movies and books is really dark and shocking. But you can also see how it's a really great ghost story that has influenced so many stories in so many different cultures around the world. But overall, I thought that looking into this legend that it was based off of, I found it to be far more interesting than the film itself. But I always do love to see how an artist can take something such as a legend or a myth or folklore and turn it into something new and refreshing. And I think that's what they really did with Ju-on and The Grudge. You can definitely see the inspiration from the source material, but it takes it into a modern stage, and it shows it in a new light so that modern audiences can be just as scared as audiences probably were 300 years ago when they read it. Well, I want to thank you so much for watching. If you like breakdowns like this, I love to do these kind of things on my channel. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next. I also have a video right now about Peter Pan. I have ones coming soon about The Little Mermaid, Pinocchio, as well as some more movie breakdowns. And don't forget, if you subscribe to my Patreon once a month, you get access to a video early where I do a deep dive on a random topic. You can also get your name in the credits of the videos, or you can even recommend a topic for the next video. And on the way out, don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and the notification bell to see more videos just like this. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.